Thank you, Rita. I will give you the ground rules of what we're going to experience here. And this is going to be a debate that is in tune with what we've had so far. We've had both security and civil discourse, and that's going to continue. We have a number of ground rules for the debate. The proposition that our two distinguished speakers are going to be debating is that U.S. counterterrorism policies since 9/11 have been consistent with U.S. domestic and constitutional law. And debating the affirmative on that will be Professor John Yoo, who is on the faculty of Berkeley Law School and who from 2001 to 2003 was Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel. Debating the negative of that proposition will be Chip Pitts, who has many distinguished positions in his career. He was former chair of Amnesty International USA, and he's also on the faculty of the Stanford Law School. Now, at the end of this debate, we are going to ask that you exit the room that we're in here. Those who believe that the affirmative had the better case should exit through this door. Those who believe that the negative had the better case should exit through that door. And some of our assistants will be counting. We'll let you know the results sometime later in the afternoon panel. And we do hope that you will stay for the afternoon panel, which is a panel that will deal with some of the issues that we've been talking about. It will concentrate on individual rights. It will focus on the Patriot Act and other pieces of legislation that affect national security and civil liberties. It will be a very exciting panel that will be chaired by Lee Cullum here. Now, a little bit more on the ground rules. The affirmative, Professor Yoo will lead off with a 10-minute statement. Then Professor Pitts will lead off with his 10-minute statement. Afterwards, each one will have a 5-minute rebuttal. First, Professor Yoo, and second, Joe Pitts. And then we will open up to the audience for questions. And these really need to be questions, not participatory comments in the debate. And we'll let that go on for about 20 minutes. And then we will let our principal debaters each have a concluding comment for about 5 minutes. Now, I'm going to ask them to keep their own time. Some of you know that the way I do this is not to ring a bell, ring a buzzer or whatever, or hold up a card during the debate. But if they go over their allotted time, I give them what some of you already know is a Hemingway moment, which is, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for you. Are we ready, gentlemen? Professor Yoo.
I'd like to thank Professor Brown, Professor Holyfield, and the Tower Center for inviting me to join you today. It's always a great pleasure for me to leave the jurisdiction of the People's Republic of Berkeley and come to panels where I get excoriated. Like to also, it's a great pleasure to, does this come out of my time if the microphone's not working? It's also my pleasure to debate Professor Pitts, although already over lunch I have a lot of disagreements with him because he told me right before we started that the iPhone has the ability to run a stopwatch, which I've been spending the last 15 minutes trying to figure out how to work. So I'm terribly distracted. Of course, because anything the iPhone can do for your life, you have to do it, right? So if I go over time, it's Joe's fault and Apple's fault. It's also a great pleasure to come here from California to Texas because I just wanted to see where all our citizens and jobs were going. And I can see why, because in California, we would never, ever schedule a conference at 8:30 on Saturday morning and expect any undergraduates to show up. So you clearly already have us beat in the work ethic department. So I have a lot of lessons to take back with me to California, not just how to make undergraduates work harder, but also how to raise money, because when I walked from the hotel, I saw every bench I passed had somebody's name on it, which we haven't done yet at Cal, and I can take back these new rules on debate back with me, because usually when I start talking, people start already walking out before I even finish. So I'm really pleased that CM's making you wait until I'm done, and then you all have to go out. Whichever door you all go out in as a majority means that I've won. So I don't really remember. It's already confusing to me. I hope to confuse you even more about which door you're supposed to go out. But let me, seriously for a moment, this is a great time for a panel on this subject because we are just past the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And I think the most important question, and I think that really dictates how you come out on this question and a lot of the other questions we're talking about in the other panels, is whether you think the 9/11 attacks were the start of a war, or were they really a particularly destructive species of crime. And before 9/11, all the branches of government and administrations of both parties treated terrorism as crime. I remember that we sent, some of the incidents referred to in the previous panels, we sent the FBI out to investigate the USS Cole bombing, secure a crime scene, catch suspects, and bring them back for trial. And I admit, a lot of the things that the Bush administration has done and the Obama administration has continued would be unconstitutional and illegal if we were dealing with a criminal justice matter. You cannot shoot drones at American citizens because you think they're about to commit a crime. You know, we don't live in Steven Spielberg's Minority Report quite yet, right? You don't detain people without, I heard some of the people in the question and answer period say, how can we hold people at Guantanamo Bay and release them, they haven't been charged or convicted of a crime, right? We can't detain people without lawyers and without a criminal trial in federal court before a jury of your peers, unless it's war. So one question to start with was, but a lot of the extraordinary measures that the government has taken since in the last 10 years, I think do make sense and are within the traditional powers of the government if we are at war. So ask yourselves the first question, are we in a state of war or are we really still in a state of peace? To me, the 9/11 attacks, and this was the first question we faced in the Office of Legal Counsel on the night of September 11th, was, were we at war? Were the 9/11 attacks an attack and an act of war? I'll explain why I think they were. I think it was because it was a foreign opponent, because they tried to achieve political goals, and they caused a certain amount of destruction and death. They killed almost 3,000 Americans, almost destroyed the Pentagon. If they hit any of the other four sides of the Pentagon, they would have destroyed the building. By luck, they hit the most recently renovated and reconstructed part of the building. They destroyed the World Trade Center towers. Right? Ask yourselves, I think the reason it's confusing to people, even today, is because the nature of the enemy. Right? Ask yourselves, if another nation state, if the Soviet Union in the Cold War had carried out the 9/11 attacks in exactly the same way, would we have any doubt that we would be in a state of war? The real problem, the confusion, is caused by the nature of the enemy. The nature of the enemy is a non-state actor. Members come from many different countries. It camouflages itself among civilians, doesn't fight openly, doesn't have normal armed units. In fact, if you think about the very way that al-Qaeda fight against us is by violating the most critical and core rule of war that goes back to the ancient Greeks, which is that you must distinguish between civilians and combatants and try to spare civilians as much as possible from harm. Think about how Al-Qaeda undertook the 9/11 attacks. They snuck into the country disguised as civilians, hijacked civilian airliners, crashed, at least in New York City, crashed them into a purely civilian target without any military value. They try to encourage attacks on civilians by refusing to distinguish themselves openly as the enemy, but instead trying to pretend to be civilians. So my one question is, so should we actually restrain ourselves in the use of war powers and the use of the tools of military combat because our enemy chooses to fight in a way which nations have for thousands of years thought was immoral, illegal, and dishonorable and should be extirpated? So taking that we're at war, then I think that answers the question for the most part of have counterterrorism policies since 9/11 been legal? Once we are in a state of war, unusual things happen. Right? We're used to the domestic process where Congress sets policy by legislation, the president executes it. I think in wartime, that relationship is flipped upside down. In wartime, the initiative goes to the executive. In fact, that's the whole reason for the creation of the executive. The executive branch was included by the framers of our Constitution because they understood that there could be unforeseen events, emergencies, and so on, that a legislature couldn't handle. Right? Legislatures are very bad at predicting the future, and they're very bad at acting quickly. We've seen that under the Articles of Confederation. The presidency is created by framers so that some part of the government is always in being and can respond quickly and swiftly to events. And I put to you, that's what 9/11 was. 9/11 triggered a war. The executive responded by leading the country, making a number of policy decisions that perhaps still are controversial, but that's the executive's function. Congress, I think, plays more of a secondary role. Their main purpose and their main job is to provide funding, the military itself, and if they ever disagree with an executive branch policy, they always have the option of cutting off funds, which is how a number of our wars have ended, and sometimes counteracting executive policy in the other direction, right? Bobby talked earlier about the Congress is more aggressive in terms of keeping Guantanamo Bay open. The executive branch is now. And Congress, how did the Congress keep Guantanamo Bay open right now? They're using the funding power to reverse or at least to counteract the policy of the Obama administration. The other thing I would say is because of that, Congress doesn't have the constitutional authority that it would normally have in domestic peacetime affairs to simply overrule the executive branch whenever it feels like. Right? I'll put to you this way. A lot of the arguments we're having in the first two panels are about, well, what if the executive wants to follow one policy, Congress wants to follow another policy? When it comes to domestic affairs, Congress will win. But I think when it comes to foreign affairs, the Constitution gives the balance to the executive. So that's just one question. Before you even get to questions I think should be easier, which are questions about how is a war to be fought once it's started, right? Ask yourself this question. What about the issue of when war should start at all? You would think Congress's powers would be at their maximum in balancing out or counteracting the executive there, right? And Congress tried to do that in something called the War Powers Resolution, right, which prohibits the president from using force abroad for more than 60 days, right? No president has ever followed that law, and Congress has really never tried to enforce it. In fact, in Libya, the Obama administration claimed that the Libyan intervention isn't even a war. So that doesn't even have to confront the constitutional issue, which many other presidents have faced, which is that they're just not going to follow the War Powers Resolution because it's an unconstitutional infringement by Congress on the executive branch. And so I'd say that's what's happened in several other areas of the war on terror. Similar efforts by Congress have passed laws before 9/11 ever happened without ever being able to think through or anticipate that we would ever be attacked by surprise by an enemy that wasn't a nation state, like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act or the Anti-Torture Act or the War Crimes Act that we mentioned. These are all statutes written well before 9/11, before we thought that we would ever have to fight a non-nation state that could infiltrate our country. Right? And in those cases, I think the laws are in conflict, and they're not always in conflict. There are many cases where the executive branch acted harmoniously with Congress, and every time I would add that Congress has been asked to ratify what the president has done, it has. Right? But in all those cases where there are conflicts, I think that the president's power as a commander-in-chief during a war should survive. And I'll give you, just to end, 2 examples to ask yourself if you are of the other opinion, right? So if you're of the other opinion and you want to be consistent, then you must think that the Libyan intervention is unconstitutional. Right? We're sending out drones to kill the head of state of another sovereign country. Right? We're helping a rebellion in another country succeed against its existing regime. And it went on for longer than 60 days. If you really think that Congress can pass laws to constrain the executive during a going war, then isn't the Libyan war unconstitutional, and shouldn't everybody be jumping up and down and filing lawsuits calling for investigations of all the Attorney General and everyone who gave President Obama the advice that he could go into Libya? The other harder question, and we were talking over lunch about history and its relationship with constitutional law, how about the Emancipation Proclamation, where President Lincoln freed all the slaves? Right? At this time, the Supreme Court had... Do I keep talking after you hit it, or just pause? I'm just kidding. I'm actually, despite what you hear, very good at following rules some of the time. So just on the Emancipation Proclamation, the Supreme Court in Dred Scott said slavery was constitutional. The Congress had actually passed a program on how to free the slaves, which was one by one in individual court hearings. President Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, in the middle of the Civil War, decided as a war measure that the slaves should all be freed who are in the South. And if you think that Congress has to set initial policy on war and the president has to carry it out, and Congress can override presidential policy in fighting a war, then you have to think, I believe, that the Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional. Thank you.
Thank you. Chip Pitts, your 10 minutes.
Well, I hope you give me more than 10, because he had a few extra ones. But I would like to thank Professor Brown
10.57
and Jim Holyfield and Rita Kirk and our other host here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Oh. There was a lot there in the 13 minutes that John took. I'm going to just race through some of the counter-arguments to try to cover the bases. I would like to say at the outset that I don't think we should accept, obviously, this completely unlimited concept of war. That's the key. And let me use the criteria that he just designated for war. Number 1, it's a foreign opponent. Well, he's from the People's Republic of Berkeley. Number 2, political goals, well-known conservative ideologue. Number 3, he causes destruction and death. Say no more. I hope we don't have a war here, John, but I would still...
We know who'd win.
Oh, yeah? No, I think that we really do have to remember the basics here, that there are rules, they do matter. Just taking John's, and I want to make 3 points or areas of response. The first one being questioning the theory of the unitary executive, which he's just alluded to, that in times of war, the president has more expansive powers. I think that's unquestionably true. But again, what John said in the memos and what he said in his writings, like his book War, I'll give you a plug, John, War by Other Means, they certainly were other means, are that those literally are unlimited. And no one has said that before. I mean, there is a distinct debate and scholarship about the elastic nature of the executive power in wartime. That's uncontroversial. What is very controversial is to say that there are no limits whatsoever. So I'll come back to that when I talk about the second aspect that I'd like to deal with, which is the manifestation of this theory in the torture memos and the policies. And then thirdly, if I have time, I'd like to just touch on some of the other civil liberties violations. Because after all, our proposition today is that U.S. counterterrorism policies since 9/11 have been consistent with the U.S. laws and Constitution. Is there anyone in this room, besides John Yoo, who believes that? All right, I declare a victory, and we can all walk out that door. Thank you. I mean, it's just a ludicrous proposition, isn't it? I mean, we all know that there was the Convention Against Torture, which is a treaty ratified by our Congress, which, according to Article 6 of the Constitution of the Supremacy Clause, is the supreme law of the land. We know that that was manifested in a U.S. statute, the torture statute, anti-war crime statute, that puts it as a matter of hard law. It's a felony, a war crime, to torture. We know that there was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that makes it a felony to spy warrantlessly on the American people, and yet that law was broken. We know that U.S. citizens like Jose Padilla, Yasser Hamdi, born in my hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, were imprisoned for years without charge, terribly abused. And again, with no accountability for these violations so far. We know that the Constitution requires that habeas corpus, and it's the text of the Constitution, only be suspended by Congress in limited cases of invasion and rebellion. And we know that the administration did not provide habeas corpus rights to these detainees until they were required to by a very conservative Republican majority Supreme Court. So I don't think there's any question that laws were violated. If we have to ask that question, we're in deeper problems than we think, because the lawyer's mentality has triumphed, and we don't want that in the United States, that's for sure. Let me just race through some of the other detailed responses to what he just claimed. On the idea of this global unlimited war, the global war against terrorism. I used to be a magician when I was a kid. I earned my way through school by doing magic tricks for birthday parties, and I know misdirection when I see it. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a clear case of misdirection here. Things like terror never end. The well-known critiques of that concept are valid. It's an irredeemably flawed, illogical, inappropriate concept for all the reasons you've heard, and I'd urge you to remember. It's very dangerous. The GWOT, the global war on terror, is not the same thing as a normal war paradigm where you have battlefields. And again, there's not a lot of controversy. If a U.S. citizen even is shooting us on the battlefield, as John Walker Lind apparently was in Afghanistan, there's a right to even a license to kill that person. A limited right. It's got to be a military objective, not to think that they're a civilian target, but the laws of war apply. What John Yoo and his memos has done, and the other colleagues of his in the OLC at the time, Jay Bybee, now a federal judge and so forth, they've basically said the law of armed conflict with this new idea of global war displaces all the other law, international human rights law, the local criminal laws that would apply. That's an unsustainable concept. It's bad law, and it's bad in practice as well. As we've discussed earlier today in some of the panels, the failure to stop 9/11 was not the lack of adequate war powers or surveillance powers or government authorities. It was the failure to connect the dots, as described now in numerous books by the 9/11 Commission and otherwise. And so I don't think that we should be captive with this very dangerous concept of the global war on terror that no other countries in the world agree with. The second thing that John is arguing is that sometimes, and it's a little bit ambiguous, sometimes, in a context like a war, you can put aside other laws. So the president's empowered to ignore, say, the Convention Against Torture or the anti-torture statute, the war crime statute. Again, I ask you if that's a sustainable position as a matter of law or policy. I think we know it isn't. Our country was founded in revolution against precisely that sort of arbitrary claim by another imperial executive, King George at the time, where the Declaration of Independence has a litany of the abuses, breaking into colonist homes and so forth. And I think that if we go down that road, we're going to see the practical consequences that we have seen, which are backlash around the world, a decline in American legitimacy, a decline in cooperation, as with the German authorities who refused to cooperate with the U.S. this year on intelligence, as with the Europeans and Canadians who have refused to extradite suspects because they're afraid that they will either be tortured by the U.S. or rendered to torture by our allies. So we have both legal and policy problems with that approach. Let me now say a few words at least about the many other civil liberties violations we've seen. I mentioned the NSA warrantless surveillance program. The problem with a lot of these is that they're in secret. This program is still secret, and so most Americans are completely ignorant and oblivious to the fact that they even exist, let alone that the government is now asserting authority to listen into your phone calls, read your emails, monitor your web surfing habits without any kind of limits, at their unilateral executive discretion. This is the sort of situation we have. The Patriot Act, which is originally a temporary emergency law that was passed within weeks of 9/11, was not read by Congress before passage. Now that emergency law had 16 renewable provisions. It's now decreased to a few. It's now 3 renewable provisions. The law is effectively permanent. We now have taken the emergency law and we've enacted a state of emergency equivalent to what Syria had or Egypt or Tunisia before the Arab Spring. And it's very ironic that we're doing this at the time, we're seeing an upsurge in freedom around the world. There are also discriminatory racial profiling practices, all sorts of other civil liberties violations that we can get into. But let me just drill down on some of the tactics that I think that we should be aware of that John approved. And this is just from Time Magazine, their story about Katani and Gitmo in 2006. Severe sleep deprivation, severe isolation, religious and sexual humiliation, threats of rendition to countries that torture, threats made against his family, including female members, strip searching, body searching, forced nudity, including the presence of female personnel, denial of the right to practice his religion, including prohibited from praying, threatening to desecrate the Quran in front of him, humiliating by forcing him to bark like a dog, dance with a mask on his face, pick up piles of trash, placing him in stress positions for prolonged periods, threats and attacks by dogs, beatings, forcible administration of IV to the point that he urinated on himself, and of course, exposure to loud music, lots of other things that were specifically approved in these torture memos that John wrote. Now let me give you the reaction to some of the memos, not from people from the ACLU or anything, but from former Attorney General McCasey. He said the work was slovenly. Former OLC, Office of Legal Counsel head, and the office that John worked for said they are riddled with errors, a, quote, one-sided effort to eliminate any hurdles posed by the torture law, unquote, an abysmal piece of work that uses the veneer of legal scholarship to create an aura of legitimacy for near-death interrogation tactics and unconstrained executive power, unquote. Another successor OLC head, Dan Levin, said, this is insane. Who wrote this? And then you have David Margolis, the lawyer who decided that John was not guilty of the intentional professional misconduct that a 5-year Office of Professional Responsibility investigation said. David Margolis, the lawyer who declined to proceed against John, said, while I've declined to adopt OPR's findings of misconduct, I fear that John used loyalty to his own ideology and convictions, clouded his view of his obligations to his client, and led him to author opinions that reflected his own extreme, albeit sincerely held views of executive power. Even Ruth Wedgwood and Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, wrote a Wall Street Journal article objecting, saying, we do not live in the 14th century when an outlaw was treated like a wild beast. The president's need for wise counsel is not well served by arguments that bend and twist to avoid any legal restrictions. And that's what the legal memos did. They did not cite the leading precedent on executive authority, the Youngstown Steel case, where President Truman seized the steel mills in World War II, in the Korean War. They also answered not just some, but every single question about every single one of the tactics, those including those I read, and of course, notoriously including waterboarding, which has been torture since the time of the Spanish Inquisition. They've answered all of those in the affirmative. And this is a problem, ladies and gentlemen. We have a guardian who's taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, the laws of the United States, write a memo that is so transparently problematic. Contrast that, however, with what John says in his edited book and this one. I'll just read this and I'll stop.
If he wants to read from my book, that's fine.
Yeah.
You let him keep going so I don't have to correct this, something I don't have to correct later.
John says, now contrast what this says with the actual tactics that I listed that were in the memo. But would it limiting a captured terrorist to 6 hours sleep, nothing big deal about that, isolating him, interrogating him for several hours, or requiring him to exercise constitute severe physical and mental pain and suffering? That's the sort of misleading analysis we have. The exact same quote is in John's new edited collection with the head of the Federalist Society called Confronting Terror. I'm very concerned, ladies and gentlemen, that we should even be questioning these issues. They're obviously trying to defend the indefensible. And if we're going to get back on an effective case, an effective path of effective counterterrorism, and one that respects our nation's laws and deepest values, I would urge that we must see this clearly and take strong measures to ensure we never do this again.
Thank you, Chip Pitts. Professor Yu, 5-minute rebuttal.
Well, I can't put on a personal defense in 5 minutes, so I'll try to do some of it in the question and answers. I was afraid this was going to be ad hominem, and I'm afraid it has been, but let me just try to focus on the substance. First, there's this odd claim that the presidents are running around conducting policy without any support from Congress, and in fact, violations from Congress, including the idea whether this is even a war. I mean, you think from what you just heard that we're not even in a state of war, right? I assume that means that you think that the killing of Osama bin Laden, who's in Pakistan, he's not in an Afghanistan battlefield, was illegal. And I assume you must think that the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki just recently was also illegal. Right? He's shot, he's killed by a drone missile. He's an American citizen, and he's not even in Afghanistan or the Pakistan region. Right? Those are the American government killing people. I would agree with you, if we were not in war, those would be crimes. But we are in a state of war. It's not just the presidents deciding this on their own. And I would ask that you be consistent across administrations if this is your view. This is not just the view of the presidents, right? Congress passed a statute right after the 9/11 attacks called the Authorization to Use Military Force, where it gave support to the president for the use of force against anyone connected with the 9/11 attacks. It is not restricted by geography, as you might think from Mr. Pitts' presentation. It just says the government is allowed to use force to attack anybody who's responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Right? The president and the Congress agree. And as I also think you just heard, no court has ever found that we are not in a state of war. All the lower courts have agreed. The Supreme Court hasn't judged yet on actions outside the Afghanistan region, but they have certainly upheld the fact that we are at war in that region. Two, on this question that's raising the torture around us, I wish I was so comforted, or at least I was so comfortable as you are, that I have all the right answers as to exactly what torture was, exactly a few months after the 9/11 attacks. You would think that, or that I knew exactly what the separation of powers says, and that's obvious. I could take a book off the shelf and I could say, oh, the Youngstown case gives me the answers about how the separation of powers works in wartime. Anyone I think who is being candid and honest would have to admit that both of those questions were unsettled at the time of the 9/11 attacks, were unsettled at the time of the capture of Abu Zubaydah, who is the person who the interrogation methods were approved for, not al-Qahtani or whoever else you might think it was. And those put the question to the government I wish we never had to face, but which we had to face, which is the United States had the fortune to capture the top leaders of al-Qaeda, not the very top, but people in charge of ongoing plots against the United States. They were resistant to normal interrogation methods, and the question put to the lawyers was, how far could we go? These were, you easily, I guess you know torture when you see it, and you see it a lot. I think there are other opinions, and one of the problems with these questions is there were no cases defining torture under American law at the time. There were no prosecutions brought. So you all have an amazing amount of certainty about what the law requires and what it means that I think are actually much harder questions. Finally, let me say about the separation of powers. These are the questions that we've been fighting about in our republic for 200 years. And to think that there's a book that you can pull off the shelf and just give you the answer, the reason why that we even had to write that part of the memo and even raise the question of what would happen if there's a conflict between the president and Congress was because the law was ambiguous and future administrations might disagree with the decisions we were making. So we actually tried to do it out of an abundance of caution. But obviously, I think the president certainly didn't think, and the lawyers in the government did not think that the interrogation methods that were suggested and approved actually violated the torture statute. But we had to acknowledge the possibility that the statute was vague and that powers are often in disagreement. So here's my closing thing. So everyone says, oh, these are things done in our name, and we've ruined our reputation in the world and so on. I'm not so sure whether that's true, or I think any country is going to act any differently towards us. But the other fact I think you forgot to mention is that if you want to look at the practical consequences, there's not been another successful attack on this country in the last 10 years. The United States has been extremely successful in killing the top leadership of al-Qaeda based on intelligence that was acquired from those interrogations. And despite your claims about the Patriot Act and the Foreign Sovereign, I think that civil liberties are fairly robust in this country. And I think they're more so than they were 10 years ago.
Thank you. John, you? Chip, it's your 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay. In addition to being a magician, I used to play tennis, and I loved McEnroe when he said, "You can't be serious." Well, you can't be serious. We have a limited time, but again, misdirection involved. The authorization to use military force it said nothing about sidestepping the laws of war. Yes, we have a legitimate traditional war in Afghanistan. We have a less well-conceived war in Iraq, and the laws of war clearly apply there. But what John has defended is the whole regime of warrantless surveillance, of torture. Now, torture, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is not just any norm. It's one of the strongest legal norms in the world. It's what we call a jus cogens norm. These are norms that apply even if the treaties didn't exist. There are no exceptions to violating the torture norm. Not a state of emergency, not a war. This norm applies everywhere. It's in the Geneva Conventions. It's in the Convention Against Torture, which President Ronald Reagan signed. The U.S. took the lead in constructing these regimes of laws of war to try to do something to make it more humanitarian. And yet, we've heard the tactics that were approved, again, with not citing the leading authorities. John just said, and I can't believe he's still saying this sort of thing, this is not an ad hominem attack, John. This is actually just pointing out the failure to recognize reality. There were cases that you did not cite. There were U.S. court cases. There were the War Crimes Tribunal cases where our soldiers had been waterboarded by Japanese and so forth, and we had prosecuted them for torture and war crimes. There's no question these precedents were out there. They just weren't cited in your memo, and you still haven't acknowledged that the U.S. tortured. On one hand, you're saying, torture can be waived by the president. On the other hand, you're saying these aren't torture techniques. It's very unclear what your position is.
My position is we did not
Please
torture.
don't interrupt. I'm just trying to finish. On the drone attacks, I do have a problem with drone attacks entering a sovereign state, killing even U.S. citizens. Anwar al-Awlaki is a U.S. citizen. He had no due process, which is a right of his under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. No right to confront the secret evidence against him, no right to confront the witnesses against him. His teenage son, a 16-year-old American teenage boy, was killed last Friday. Most people don't even know about that. Hasn't been widely reported in the media. Several other U.S. citizens, Kamal Durwash was killed, just assassinated by the U.S. off of any battleground in Yemen. That's where these take place. Now, this is a very serious problem. It could happen to you. You could be labeled an enemy combatant and have your liberty gone. Right now, you could be sitting here under the Patriot Act, Section 213, I think it is. Your home could be searched without the traditional knock and announce rule that the Supreme Court required under the Fourth Amendment. These are new legal rules that are unlike any rules in our history. They are exactly the opposite of what the rules were at the founding, where the general warrants of King George allowed knocking down the doors of colonists, searching their possessions, and so forth, without probable cause. That's why the Fourth Amendment says you must have a warrant and probable cause. That's the default rule. There are exceptions, hot pursuit and so forth, but we have a problem if we are going to forget that history and to say that there were no cases on this. We're not sure about the bad consequences. Well, it's not just al-Qaeda anymore. Sure, we have decimated al-Qaeda. We have assassinated, the U.S. has, Osama bin Laden. But al-Qaeda has metastasized. The empirical evidence cited by scholars and experts on terrorism like Peter Bergen and Robert Pape are that suicide bombings have increased, according to Robert Pape's statistics, 16,000%. The world is, these nations had 80% approval ratings. Now they have 8% or 1% or 2% approval ratings. Pakistan, a nuclear power, one of the top issues in Pakistan that I hear about when I go to the UN or these international meetings, the diplomats say, our population is up in arms about this. And it's a nuclear power that we are destabilizing. If you have more people killed, as Admiral Dennis Blair, the former National Security Obama said, the drone attacks just We'll have people replaced by other al-Qaeda operatives while turning the people of Pakistan against us. That is a serious national security threat, as is, by the way, this entire new architecture of the Department of Homeland Security, as very carefully traced by Dana Priest and Bill Arkin in their Top Secret America series in the Washington Post and their new book on the subject that came out about a month ago. These overreaching new bureaucratic agencies are so numerous, a couple of thousand, they don't communicate. We're actually making the information sharing problem harder and the effectiveness of our counterterrorism project much, much harder by taking these counterproductive actions. I do agree that Obama should not take refuge in the cagey lawyer words of whether hostilities exist in Libya. That was appalling. The War Powers Act should be complied with, just as U.S. citizens, yes, should not be assassinated in other sovereign states by these robotic drone attacks from the air.
Chip. Good. Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. You will each have an opportunity to collect some of your thoughts and rebuttals in the last 5 minutes that we will allot each of you. I would hope that now, despite what is going on between you, that you will address directly the questions that come from our audience. Yes, Jeff?
question once for the whole 10-year period, or should we answer it policy by policy?
To whom do you want that question? Okay.
John,
Professor Yu.
First, I want to apologize for interrupting Chip. I just got so overexcited, and I had to be quiet all morning, so I apologize for jumping in on him. I promise I won't do it again for the next 5 minutes. I would say that you have to make a decision about this war, not policy by policy, but just at the beginning, because if you put it this way, if you don't, then I think you can't undertake most of the policies that the Bush administration has and the Obama administration has conducted. And so I don't think you could say, well, you know, with the Patriot Act, we're really at peace, but with drone attacks, we're really at war. I think you have to decide up front what kind of conflict we're in, or if we're in any conflict, because that doesn't, once you make that decision, that doesn't mean that you have to exercise all the war powers to their maximum extent, right? So just because we're in a war doesn't mean that we have to invade other countries. Obviously, the United States can be more restrained than they would be permitted under the rules of war, but you still, I think, have to decide that one way or another in the beginning. The other thing that would give me pause if we approached it that way was, I think you do have men and women in uniform and in the intelligence agencies who are firing drone missiles at people or intercepting surveillance or fighting on the ground in Afghanistan or Pakistan with special forces. And you don't want them to be operating in some kind of fog of uncertainty, right? Because they're going to wonder whether what they're doing is legal, and then they're going to be restraining themselves or even thinking about it as something that we don't want to distract them from that. So I think you do need to. My view is that the branches of our government made that decision in the first week after 9/11. The president announced we were at war on September 12th, I believe, and then in September 18th, Congress agreed in the authorization to use military force.
Chip.
I think what's novel here is not the nature of this particular threat, but the obviously novel concept of the global war on terror that's completely unprecedented in world history. It's that's the fog of war is created when you're chartered as a military official with fighting a global battle anywhere, and a lot of the military people have objected to this for that reason. You know, a lot of the folks I've met with in Iraq and Afghanistan find it very, very problematic that we have that. I have 4 other reservations I was just noting. First, overbroad policies in wars are always justified with this idea that it's a new, unprecedented threat. Thucydides described the way Sparta thought Athens had posed a completely, quote, completely new threat, unquote, therefore had to be attacked preemptively. Same with the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, same with the nuclear threat from USSR. If you think about it, the new threats are always new, and yet we have evolved over millennia the laws of war to deal with that, and they don't displace the other laws in the world, domestic criminal law, international human rights war. Secondly, is the GWAT approach, the global war on terror approach, the best, even if you just look at it from a reciprocal standpoint? What if these tactics are used on our soldiers? What if other people can, as Iran was alleged to have done, enter the U.S. and assassinate people here? What if they can try to assassinate our leaders? I could quote from John's book again. I've got the passage here if he wants me to do so. But he actually says that under his concept, what al-Qaeda did on 9/11 was legal. John, do I need to read that quote? Or
I don't remember it, but I'm willing to take it on faith that I said it.
Well, it's on page. All right, if you're willing to take it on faith. I mean, that's the implication, the reciprocity. You know, if we take these approaches, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, they could all attack preemptively. Thirdly, even if you consider the risk, you know, of effective counterterrorism and rights, you know, to these policies, what about militarizing it at home? There's nothing in the authorization to use military force that says that the American people are the enemy, that we can have domestic surveillance on them, that they can be seized as enemy combatants, that they can be killed on any sovereign nation anywhere in the world. And then fourth, how has this excessive and novel interpretation worked historically in practice, not just in the last 10 years. But think about, you know, historically, the history of warfare, where mutually destructive wars were so often inaugurated on this claim that you have to prevent it before it happens. Sparta's declaring war against Athens again. Carthage's preemptive attack on Rome. Centuries of European war. A.J.P. Taylor, the British historian, said they almost always brought, quote, disaster upon their originators. And Germany's attack on Russia to start World War II, etc., Japanese on Pearl Harbor. These are all overbroad responses that, like the overbroad responses here at home domestically, have been regretted later.
Can we open it up more to the
Sure,
audience?
absolutely.
All right. Yes, Sandy.
Position, I say that up front, but I want to ask a question from a devil's advocate point of view. And this is the kind of question that a philosopher would typically ask. And I'm sure you heard the example of a terrorist in Manhattan that knows about a nuclear bomb about to be exploded, and the only feasible way of preventing that is to torture the person to get the information to stop that. So the question is really, are there no exceptions at all to the prohibition of torture? As you mentioned, the various treaties seem to be exceptionalist. So that's kind of extreme example. But if you admit that, then you're on a slippery slope, and how far down that slope do you go to other examples somewhat less extreme, but perhaps still credible?
Is that a question for me or both?
Why don't you take that first,
Okay.
because it's challenging your premise,
sure.
and then we'll let John.
This is the famous ticking time bomb hypothetical, and it's analogous to the rationale for the preemptive war against Iraq. The smoking gun that we didn't want to be a mushroom cloud. And the famous deconstructions of that, I think, are very compelling. First of all, it's never right or legal, right? We have to start there. Torture has been accepted as a norm resisted by civilized peoples and unlegal, since at least the time of Voltaire, when they said precisely that. And there's been progress and legalization, institutionalization of that. But you have to, in order to adopt the reasoning of the ticking time bomb hypothetical, you have to think torture works. And now it's beyond question that it doesn't work. The military interrogators, the leading experts in this, people like Matthew Alexander, who's written a book on it, Eric Sars, Ali Soufan, the FBI interrogator who interrogated Abu Zubaydah. And by the way, it was false, clearly false, that that interrogation using normal non-coercive methods failed to produce the information. It was Ali Soufan who got the courier information that, if there was any link to Osama bin Laden's later killing, it was that. It wasn't the contractor who came in and waterboarded him 83 times. It wasn't the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 183 times. They got this information. Just the numbers, common sense will tell you, the technique obviously didn't work if they had to do it 183 times, right? And so the assumption behind the tipping bomb hypothetical is that you have the person, that they have the knowledge, that they will give it to you, and you could stop the event, right? And there are lots of other intermediary assumptions, but all of those are false. There's no way. In fact, Al-Qaeda is trained to resist interrogation. If you can get a terrorist to break, they're going to do what? They're going to tell you what you want to hear to stop the harm, the pain that they're experiencing. So there's no guarantee at all that you get reliable information, and in fact, the empirical evidence now is overwhelmingly to the contrary from the people who know best. Ali Soufan was there. Rumsfeld, Cheney, you were not there, as Ali Soufan said on the Colbert Report the other night. And therefore, you get unreliable information if you torture, and it can be very serious. Sheikh al-Libi, who was tortured in Egypt at our behest, was the one that gave the bad information that Saddam was connected to al-Qaeda and had, weapons of mass destruction. That was a key predicate for the Iraq War, which has been such a fiasco.
John, your response to the question.
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question, and as a person who raised the question knows, it's commonly debated in the philosophy journals and so on, and it's usually seen as shows whether you're utilitarian or not, if you accept that you can interrogate someone harshly, even commit torture because of the great benefit that you might achieve. I think it's helpful to think about I would admit that I don't think that any of the interrogations in the first year were of that nature, because there were no, as far as we knew, no ticking nuclear weapons in downtown New York City. On the other hand, I think that the interrogation methods used are not the kind of things that we think of as torture. And that's just the view we have, because as I said, I don't think that there were any cases or precedents on the torture statute. All the examples that have been raised are things that happened before that statute. Congress didn't explain when it passed the statute exactly what it had in mind. I just ask any of you to go look at the statute and try to decide exactly what line it draws. It's written in very vague terms, as I think people who've read this actually well know. But take yourself back to the circumstances and ask yourself whether you would use interrogation methods of the kind that the government used in those days, right? So we're talking about the first year after the 9/11 attacks, when the government, and I think most terrorist experts expected there to be a second attack on the country. That had been al-Qaeda's modus operandi, right? The United States knew very little about al-Qaeda. We'd had things like anthrax and other things that people thought might have been terrorist attacks. We were not sure. And so what the United States did was the CIA came up with interrogation methods that were drawn from the methods used on American soldiers who might be captured to train them to resist interrogation. Right? This is not some cooked up thing that they came up with. They went and researched and said that these methods have been used on over 20,000 US officers and CIA agents without negative consequences, right? Without any that would fit the statute. So then the question is, if you have those kinds of methods available and you're in that kind of situation, would you actually, I think, take the view that no, we're not going to use any kind of coercive measures. We're just going to give them a lawyer or just not question them at all and just have them sit. I would say actually that you have to make those kind of cost-benefit decisions when you're put in a position of authority, and then ask yourself, how did it come out? Right? Did the benefits outweigh the costs? I would say that putting aside what people say on the Colbert Report, that people like Leon Panetta, who was the head of the CIA, or Michael Hayden, who was head of the CIA, or Michael Mukasey, who was the Attorney General, said that it did produce information which did stop terrorist attacks, and that did produce the information that led us to Osama bin Laden, to the courier and his location eventually, and allowed us to kill him.
Okay.
If I may,
Further,
Sam, I'd like to respond to some of the factual issues before we lose track of them.
Yeah, we have just a little bit of time so do it during your concluding remarks, okay? Yes.
First of all, as far as the use on American soldiers, isn't it true that they always had the ability to stop it then and there, and so it's not analogous to what was going on to the prisoners? And secondly, there was the whole paradox about the SEER program that what we thought had been done in Korea was contrary to the laws of war. We objected to the use of things like waterboarding, and so it was preparing American soldiers to undergo something, but they were prepared to undergo something that we regarded as being illegal.
So first, I assume, yeah. So first let me say, in terms of waterboarding, right, it's used on 3 people. Right? I think if we want to talk about facts, it was used on 3 people who are thought to be al-Qaeda leaders. It's not widely used. It's used in very discrete circumstances. Second, one thing that you have to ask under the torture statute is, does the use of this interrogation method cause any kind of long-term physical or mental pain and suffering? Look, I wish we didn't have to talk about these things, but I think we had to. I mean, we're confronted with these issues because of the nature of this war. That's why you look at the 20,000 Americans who went through it to see what happened to them afterwards, regardless of whether they said, I don't want to do it, or 20,000 Americans did go through it. And there are records about what happened to them afterwards. That's more why it's important rather than whether it's voluntary.
This was an experimental program, by the way, for those of you who don't know. This was not captured Americans. Yeah.
No. This is to train people like American pilots who might be shot down and captured by the enemy, or CIA agents and people like that who might be captured by the enemy. I don't think that our military or our CIA thought they were torturing those 20,000 Americans when they put them through SEER training, even if regardless of whether the person said they could or not. And then the last thing is, I think there is a difference here and I think this is coming through a little bit in the morning panels, but the difference between international law and domestic law. So it might be the case that the United States has taken some positions about international law and about what we want other countries to do. And we do it for reciprocal reasons or not, or because we want to force countries to obey certain kinds of norms, right? That's interesting, but in terms of the question that we're supposed to be debating today, I think, and that was a question that was before us back then, is what does the statute that Congress passed mean, right? Even if we had taken a contrary position, this is actually more raised by the Geneva Conventions. I think State Department, our military, always want the enemy to follow the Geneva Conventions, right? But I think legally, as a matter of American law, the Geneva Conventions just did not apply to al-Qaeda because they never signed the treaty. They aren't a nation state, and they never said that they would follow any of the laws of war. So I can't see legally how the Geneva Conventions would apply. That's very different than any kind of position we might have taken in international politics about what we want other countries to do.
Okay, on the last point, obviously the Supreme Court has disagreed with John. The Geneva Conventions in 2006 were held to apply. Common Article 3, the minimum of humane treatment applies to Al-Qaeda and anyone. On this SEER program, the gentleman asking the question is absolutely right. What we've done in SEER was taking tactics that we had considered torture, and we had given a limited, controlled experiment to people for 70 hours to see if they could resist them. They could stop, and most importantly, they knew they weren't going to really be harmed seriously by their colleagues. And it was, again, 70 hours, not 70 weeks or 70 years in indefinite detention or having it done 183 times. And just on waterboarding and the definition of torture, the torture memos actually say, and this is a great little resource because it includes the most recent memos that were released in April of 2009. Quote, the waterboard, which inflicts no pain or actual harm whatsoever. Now this is, I have to digress, waterboarding is not simulated drowning. It's actually drowning and stopping, hopefully before death. That doesn't always happen, but hopefully you stop before death. It's actual drowning. And yet this memo says it does not, in our view, inflict, quote, severe pain or suffering, unquote. Even if one were to parse the statute more finely to attempt to treat suffering as a distinct concept, the waterboard could not be said to inflict severe suffering. This is a technique that stops you from breathing, ladies and gentlemen. The waterboard is simply a controlled acute episode, lacking the connotation of a protracted period of time generally given to suffering, unquote. I take the Potter-Stewart pornography test on torture. Basically, I know it when I see it. If it's going to be done to my soldiers defending me and my country or my family, I have a problem with it. There's no way that you could say that waterboarding is not torture. It's been considered since the Spanish Inquisition. We have prosecuted it. There were cases. There was a case here in Texas that John conveniently didn't cite, even though a first-year law student could do a Lexis search and pull it up by just checking the term. All those lists of tactics I read, consider if they were used against you or your family, your mother, your child. John actually has said in congressional testimony that you could actually bury someone alive, and the president could authorize that. He said that before the House Judiciary Committee, John Conyers. He also said, I teach at Oxford with Doug Castle, a professor of international law from Notre Dame, and this is available on the web too. When asked by the Office of Professional Responsibility, about probing the limits to the president's power to disregard laws, could you crush a child's testicles to get someone to speak? And John said, yeah.
That is so untrue.
All right, let me read
Chip.
the quote, if I may. All right.
That is outrageous, Chip.
Oh, that's outrageous. I would ask anybody who wants to look at it.
Yeah, go ahead and look at it. I'm
pull it up.
sorry.
Yeah. And while I'm looking for that, the third thing I wanted to mention is, your well-known other, statements that waterboarding is not torture, that the president is without limit. Let me see if I can find it.
Can we do this?
Yeah, while I'm looking for that, I'll mention that in my conclusion.
I'll take one more question, and then we'll go into the summary part. Prakash.
When will this war, quote-unquote war, will come to an end, or will be constantly in a Hobbesian state of nature?
What about you, John, on that? When will the war against terror come to an end, or will it be perpetual?
I'm actually glad you asked that question, because I think when Chip discusses the war on terror, he makes it sound as if the United States is waging an unending war against terrorists everywhere in the world without regard to who they're fighting, what they've done in the past. And I don't think that's legally what we're about. I think the war on terror is a war against the Al-Qaeda terrorist network and any other groups that have helped it, and nations too, and individuals. And that's what the authorization to use military force that Congress passed says. So I think that the United States is just not at war against everyone who uses terrorism as a tactic. Terrorism is a tactic, it's not an enemy. So the United States is not at war with other terrorist groups all around the world who have other enemies and don't pose a threat to the United States. So I think the end of the war sort of is defined by that. If we can be at the point where Al-Qaeda's capabilities have been seriously degraded. And I think actually we're getting pretty close to it. At least that's what intelligence officers have testified before Congress are saying in Washington now, is that because of the loss of Osama bin Laden, a lot of the successful drone strikes, which I suppose are unconstitutional, illegal under Chip's view, Al-Qaeda is staggered. And so we might actually be getting to a point where they cannot launch any serious attacks against us in the United States. If that's the case, I think that's when the war is over. I'm afraid, unfortunately, because it's not a nation-state to nation-state conflict, that's going to be over whenever there's a peace treaty that's going to be signed, because I don't think that Al-Qaeda's got much intention of signing a peace treaty, nor could it get probably its members to enforce it. So we have to ask functionally what would be the equivalent of a peace treaty.
Chip, can you do it briefly?
Yes, just quite very, very simply, the war on terror will never end. Al-Qaeda itself, core Al-Qaeda is obviously diminished, but Al-Qaeda has metastasized. These are associated organizations, people inspired by what? By human rights violations. The testimony of the Muslim bomber in London, for example, or Madrid, they say things like, until you stop killing our people, raping our women, torturing our people, we will defend ourselves. That's their perspective. Now, their means are obviously illegal as well. Terrorism is to be condemned. Here are the quotes from the OPR, from the Castle quote, which is available on YouTube. Castle, if the president deems he's got to torture somebody, including by crushing the testicles of the person's child, there is no law that can stop him, ? You. No treaty, Castle. Also no law by Congress. That is what you wrote in the 2002 memo. You. I think it depends on why the president thinks he needs to do that. And then the OPR report, question on, what about ordering a village of resistance to be massacred? Is that a power the president could legally? John, yeah. Although, let me say this, so certainly that would fall within the Commander-in-Chief's power over tactical decisions. Question, to order a village of civilians to be exterminated? Answer, sure. I'm not making this stuff up.
No, but you're stopping the quotes in mid-sentence and mid-reply, Chip. I think that's terribly unfair.
You want to take a minute?
Please correct me.
Elaborate?
If you said things that countered or corrected what you said in those quotes, I would be very interested in hearing them.
Let John elaborate what you say is left off.
I mean, I don't want to interrupt. I mean, if you let me use the rest of your time, then I will.
Okay.
I would like
I'm
to answer.
finished.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I said, obviously, I would never be in favor of the United States doing anything like that. It's not any question we ever consider. It's no possible. All I said was that that's up to the president to decide. I didn't say that he could do it or he should do it. But under the laws of war in the United States, the commander-in-chief makes those decisions. I think it would be a terribly immoral thing to do. But the law doesn't tell you. The law doesn't dictate specific by specific how the president has to wage war. As to the village, I'll say, I think this is what I actually said to the investigator afterward. I said, have you ever heard of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Or have you ever heard about the fire bombings in Germany during World War II? The United States has bombed civilian targets, I'm afraid. Again, I'm not arguing in favor of it. I think those were terrible things that happened from a moral basis, but I think the Constitution is the one that leaves those decisions up to the president. I would hope the presidents use their judgment and prudence not to make those decisions. But this is the problem with this debate, is that people will say, oh, well, if the president makes decisions on war, well, then I can come up with any kind of outrageous hypothetical I want to and say that the president will do it, and therefore you must be wrong. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, the president has had this power. He has used it in wartime over many centuries. And sure, you could say, well, some extreme case a president could do it. That doesn't mean the constitutional system is somehow defective. And we have to go to a system where Congress decides how we wage war on a tactical basis.
Right. Now, we're getting to the concluding remarks. The person who has the last remark has an advantage, okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to establish the order by chance. And that is, I've written a number on this folded sheet between 1 and 10. And I'm going to ask each of you to give me a number between 1 and 10. Whoever is closest to my number will have the last word.
Which goes first? I'm a magician, you know.
Pardon?
I know what the number is. I'm a magician. This is unfair to John.
What is it?
This is like The Price is Right.
That's right. No, we had an agreed on an order. You don't want to stick to that agreement?
I think that
Under the
it's
circumstances.
been very good, a lot of back and forth, but I do regard the last word as a preferred place. So,
Okay.
What's your guess?
7.
What's yours?
So what would the right thing to do would be to guess 6, wouldn't it?
It's 6.
How many numbers do you have there?
All right, so
I'll go
Chip,
first.
Actually, since I get to
5 minutes.
choose, I'll go first and let Chip go
Well,
last.
okay.
Yeah, because it was obviously too easy for me to pick the number.
All right, well, thank you.
Even though I had no idea. This is just from years watching The Price is Right. All right. So how much time do we get? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
So, look, I think one bigger picture way to look at this, at least from my perspective, is that Chip and people like him are trying to argue that there are these very settled, strict laws of war. Every congressional statute has to be followed in wartime, and that the body of law that we had pre-9/11 was sufficient to deal with terrorism. I think that system failed. If that system had worked, the 9/11 attacks could have been stopped. In fact, if you want to go back and look at the 9/11 Commission report, there are some things that were done, like the wall between intelligence services, that prevented our country actually from stopping the 9/11 attacks when I think it could have. I think what happened on 9/11 is that we were confronted with a new kind of enemy. I think this is different. It's not the tactics are different, it's the enemy that's different. It is not a nation state. The United States in our wars in the past have never confronted an enemy like this. And so I think what happened in larger perspective is that our system had to change to adapt from rules we'd had in the past to adapt to new kinds of war. Just like, for example, in the Civil War. The notions of war that we had were very difficult, if not impossible, to apply to a rebellion where half the country tried to leave and was using military force to defend itself. A lot of those questions that we're talking about today in some ways came up for the first time in the Civil War. And so I think what happens in that kind of circumstance is that our Constitution does create a president whose job it is to respond immediately, to try to adapt to those kinds of surprises, surprise attacks, and war. And that legislatures just are not capable of doing that. That's why the Constitution, I think, did balance the powers in favor of the executive during wartime. And I think, again, I'll say, when we talk about consequences, ask yourself, do you think that the last 10 years would have been, we would have succeeded in no terrorist attacks on the country and seriously staggering al-Qaeda, hopefully to the point where they won't soon be a threat to the United States, if we had followed the pre-9/11 statutory regime, if we had looked to Congress to lead the country in setting policy on war, and if you really do think that, also then try to be, I ask you to be consistent. You must therefore think that most of President Obama's counterterrorism policies are as equally unconstitutional as the ones that President Bush promoted. And I would ask you, are you out there with the same sense of outrage and writing op-eds and writing law review articles and filing suits against the Obama administration that people were only too happy to do to the Bush administration? I actually have to confess I see a lack of intellectual consistency amongst a lot of people about counterterrorism policy who are remaining silent now, who were not so silent under the Bush administration. So I ask you, if you really do believe this, and I think you have an obligation to be consistent and to take action on those views.
Let me start with the last point. I think I have been consistent. I have written a number of op-eds against Obama's perpetuation of the same global war on terror construct. I have sued the government. I've never sued anyone in my life before, but I'm a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the Homeland Security Department and the Transportation Security Administration on the body scanners, which again are part of the security theater, multi-billion-dollar expenditure that does not detect even the plastic explosive, the PETN, that Abdul Muttalib used, and that was their purported raison d'etre. And, that's very problematic. They also expose people to health risk, the cumulative radiation. We won a decision in that it was flawed on the Administrative Procedures Act, so the government has to issue new rules, so there'll be an opportunity for you to join me in protesting that. Obama has done some things right. He committed to close Guantanamo. Congress stopped him from doing so. He did issue the executive order definitively prohibiting waterboarding, whereas it was still possible, it was still a residual tactic, even under the reformed DOJ memos that Goldsmith and Philbin put into place after John left. But all those other tactics are torture as well, the tactics that I read about with Khatami that are listed in the torture memos. John has a lot of straw men in his arguments. A straw man argument is an argument that it's a weak argument, basically, you put up just to knock down. One thinks of the Scarecrow and the Wizard of Oz. And I was about to say, I thought of if I only had a brain. But I know John is extremely intelligent. He knows better. He knows about the Youngstown Steel case that he undoubtedly teaches his Berkeley law students. He knows about the prosecutions of people that, in Japan, etc., waterboarded our troops, tortured our people. He knows that these things are torture. Torture is not, it's really not that hard to determine. There are some questions of the boundaries, but if it would experience severe physical pain, or suffering, you stop that. John quoted those dictionary definitions, and then he ignored them completely in the torture memos. He grabbed a definition from a completely unrelated healthcare part of the law that had nothing to do with it. I have no idea what rational basis there would be for that. And he came up with a definition of torture as death or serious organ failure, which means that, pulling out your fingernails, cutting off your ear, anything short of death or serious organ failure would not be torture, even though these were techniques that we have objected to. His definition would allow Saddam Hussein's torture. It would allow Gaddafi's torture, all the torture that we had traditionally condemned. He says that, quote, he just said this a few minutes ago, the law does not say anything about how the president wages war, unquote. I'm sorry, John, there's a whole body of law. It's called jus in bello, the law of war, that says precisely that. That's the point of it. That's why it's been developed over centuries. The Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. played an active role in establishing that body of law. It protects our troops. It protects our national image. It protects our ability to get cooperation from others. It protects our soft power in the human rights field and in the whole array of foreign policy objectives. And it protects who we are. If we're going to transgress those boundaries, we better do so, for a very good reason. We had a good reason after 9/11, but you're having it both ways. You're saying that, on one hand, we didn't torture, on the other hand, the torture was defensible. The quotes that you read from Hayden and Mukasey were before the release of the last memos. If you read the memos, and I commend to you this simple little collection that David Cole brought together in his excellent introduction, there is absolutely no way that you can continue to buy these arguments that these were a few bad apples, or that this was not torture. This was the first time in our nation's history that we had an official policy from the very top, authorized, saying, as he said, the Geneva Conventions don't apply. Saying that the laws of war did not apply. I believe that that these do have counterproductive consequences. I mentioned the empirical increase of terrorism that was seen since we engaged in these tactics, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, recruiting tools for al-Qaeda. More importantly, though, we're not limited to that militarization abroad. The U.S. has all the components of a police state. You may think that that's an exaggeration, but we've got the Patriot Act, the emergency law that's in place. We've got the ubiquitous warrantless surveillance. We have the racial profiling, where, just this week, the New York Times did reports about how communities of color are being targeted with the most crude stereotypes and then suspected of terrorism when they've done nothing at all to do that. We have this national security exception to racial profiling, which is what they invoke to let that happen. So there's a terrible new normal of this degraded justice system where we've got the military tribunals, the civilian trials options, no objective criteria for determining who will be in what. The main problem, however, with the GWAT paradigm, this global war on terrorism paradigm, is it's become the central organizing principle of our society. And it's actually caused massive expenditures, trillions of dollars, for things like the Homeland Security Department, the 73 fusion centers, without any productive, effective advance in counterterrorism. None of these techniques have produced a single terrorist conviction, and they haven't stopped a single attack. The attacks, the Times Square bomber, Shirzad, the underwear bomber, Abdul Muttalib, they were stopped because of either incompetence or the passengers noticing. So this multi-billion-dollar infrastructure has not made us safer. What it has done is convinced the rest of the world that far from being the proponent of the rule of law, as we had been historically, far from being the bastion of hope and rights and liberty and opportunity and creativity and entrepreneurship, we're basically regressing from that. We're regressing in the rule of law itself, which was such a competitive advantage of this country, and now we have stomped on. And yes, Obama has continued the perpetuation of these atrocities. I mean, even cruel and human-degrading treatment, there's the Ghulat Mohammed case or other instances of that. But what he has done, I think, is at least tried to move a little bit more toward reestablishing the rule of law.
Chip?
I'll finally just say, in wrapping up, that this is all about accountability, transparency and accountability. Obama did a good thing in releasing the torture memos. We still haven't had an investigation or prosecution as we were required to have under the Convention Against Torture. And I would urge that we consider that very seriously as a nation.
Chip Pitts, John Yoo, thank you for an excellent debate. Exemplary of the American tradition of debate. Thank you very much for the mutually respectful exchange that you've had. Now, those who believe that the affirmative got the best in this debate, please exit through that door. Those who believe that the negative got the best of the debate, affirmative is Professor Yu, negative is Professor Pitts. Those who believe that the negative got the best of the debate, please exit through that door. Thank you very much for coming and your attention. And don't forget the next panel.